Welcome to Learning to Glow, a show about wellness, skin health, and self-development. I'm your host, Jess. I'm a mom, entrepreneur, and skincare expert. I'm so excited to share tips on how to achieve healthy skin and bring amazing guests in the field of health, fitness, aging gracefully, and personal growth. Let's explore all different ways we can take care of ourselves as women, both inside and out, to truly shine. So let's get glowing. Hello and welcome to Learning to Glow podcast. I am your host, Jess. Thank you so much for joining me today. We have Katherine, the founder of Bravespace Nutrition, for such a powerful conversation around eating disorders, body image, diet culture, much, much more. Katherine is a Seattle-based eating disorder registered dietitian and CEO and founder of the Bravespace Nutrition, where she and her team help people heal their relationship with food and body, free from perfectionism, fear, and shame. She works with clients to help them create more flexibility and freedom with food by divesting from diet culture and helping them to cultivate peace within their bodies. She specializes in women's health, disordered eating, eating disorders, and body image. Katherine explains diet culture in a way I had never heard it talked about before and how it affects all of us. She shares how there is a spectrum of disordered eating, from severe eating disorders to body image issues, and it just taking up negative headspace and taking away from our lives. She says no matter where we are in this spectrum, that we deserve support. We discuss intuitive eating, and my favorite part of the conversation, we were talking about kids and how to help support them within this topic. So if you're a parent, you definitely want to stick around for this one. She has some very valuable and wise tips for us. So having a wellness podcast myself, it's very important for me to share this conversation because there are so many things out there. There's so much noise and fear when it comes to our food and wellness, and in this industry especially, mostly because somebody is trying to sell something. And I want this podcast to be the opposite of that. And that's why the people that I ask to be on my podcast are not here to scare anyone or to tell them that something is bad. It's about education, but also there is this other side to the wellness industry, and that's why I wanted to have Katherine on, because I feel like that needs to be talked about when we're talking about wellness. I was so honored to have Katherine join me for this episode. She is so amazing and wise. I'm so grateful that I found her. You can follow her by going to my show notes. I will link all of her information. I'm also linking some free guides and blog posts that will be helpful for moms and parents. If you have teens, tweens, children, she says it's never too late. You can sign up for her newsletter for more free resources, and I'll also link that for you. But yes, go check her out. She offers individual nutrition counseling, business coaching to weight-inclusive health professionals. You can find more information about her on Instagram. She has a great YouTube and TikTok. And I just want to say thank you so much, Katherine. This was such a great episode, and I hope you all enjoy it. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Learning to Glow podcast. Today we have Katherine. Welcome to our show.
Thank you so much for having me. Really happy to be here.
So thrilled to have you. We start all of our episodes with, if you can give us a brief introduction to who you are, what your background is, what you do, and we'll go from there.
Yeah. So my name is Katherine Metzelaar. I am a registered dietitian, certified intuitive eating counselor, and I own Bravespace Nutrition, which is a private group practice in Seattle, Washington. We are 100% virtual, so we see clients all over the country, all over the world, and we help people to, and I help people to heal their relationship with food and their body. We see people all along the spectrum, which I think is important to name. Some folks have diagnosed eating disorders. Other folks come in just really feeling confused about food, having chronically dieted or restricted throughout their life, feeling shame about their body, and just wanting all of it to take up less headspace, wanting some relief from the constant pursuit of changing their body shape and size, and wanting some resolution to the confusion that often exists because we are told so much about food and about what we should and shouldn't be eating. And usually once we hit a certain point in our life, especially in our 40s, we have, I like to think about it as like the Santa Claus bag that we've been carrying around, where even if we aren't following a particular kind of diet, we have all these rules that we're just carrying around, which can make the eating experience, I think, so confusing, so stressful. And so we help people to feel some kind of resolve around that, for food not to feel stressful, for their body and their relationship with their body to not take up so much headspace, and to feel at least some felt sense of ease or neutrality in their life and in their relationship with their body.
That's wonderful. So for your clients, we talked a little bit about this before we started recording, but there's such a range, right, of people's idea of their body. It goes from maybe just some programming that we've been exposed to throughout our lives to you have an eating disorder. There's quite a big range, and it's almost like almost everyone, I mean, it's men and women, but
Sure.
I'm sure you see mostly women. A lot of it might even be just like unconscious. We are given these ideas of what we should look like or what we should eat or what we should do. And so, how do people that are maybe not as severe on the spectrum come to find out, like, oh, I think this is occupying my brain too much. This is becoming a negative in my life and I want to seek help. How do you, for someone who's more on that end, how would they come to find you? And is it something that is just, they just personally come to a realization and know that they need to seek some help?
I think that it's a great question, and it really varies. So I have heard many people with whom I've worked with over time, and you're right, I have largely worked with women, and I'm most interested in working with women. I think that that is part of it. But nonetheless, I have heard many women say, I had no idea that this whole other way of existing in the world was possible, specifically naming diet culture and the fact that we exist in one, naming that you don't have to be on a diet to be really stuck in restrictive cycles around food, that folks will somehow, as social media goes, just sort of stumble on someone else's post that they shared with someone else. And then that kind of leads them down a path of really beginning to have the ability to name that what they've been engaged with is disordered eating. And I think that that can be really powerful because there's so much stigma around eating disorders. And when I say stigma, sometimes I think it can be hard to sort of conceptualize that. Like, what does that mean? And what I mean is that it's the things that we assume, not because we intend to, it doesn't mean that we're a bad person, but the things that we assume about eating disorders and disordered eating. So culturally, right? All we're exposed to is that eating disorders look like usually thin, young, white women, and
Mm.
usually really thin. And if it doesn't fit that category, that image, then usually what we feel like is that can't be me. I don't fit that criteria. I'm not sick enough. I'm not in that size body. And so what it leads to for a lot of women is just kind of doing the same thing that we've always done. Oh, well, we don't fit that description. We don't fit that criteria. When in fact, many women are suffering, I believe. And so, what I really like to say in my beliefs are that if it's occupying headspace, if there's chaos in the brain, you deserve support. And if there's any question around it, then it usually is an indication that you would benefit from getting additional support. And that, like I was saying before, there is a spectrum, and the spectrum just varies in severity. So someone might be diagnosed with an eating disorder because they tick all the boxes. You can fall in that spectrum and be experiencing disordered eating. It's just maybe a little less severe, a little less frequent, which doesn't mean that you're suffering less. It just means that it's maybe a little different than someone that's on a different side of the spectrum or end of the spectrum.
I love how you said you deserve support. And this, I think, can go in a lot of different categories. Like, I've heard this with drinking. I'm not that stereotypical, speaking of stigma, of the man on the street with the paper bag. So I don't have a problem and I don't need to do anything about it. And then you're kind of stuck because you think I'm fine, I'm not bad enough. I think that's what it reminded me of. And just being like, you deserve support if it is interfering with your life and it's taking up, and I told you this at the beginning of our call too. I have personal experience with all of this. So it can occupy your brain and be so negatively impactful that it's like the first thing in the morning, it's all throughout the day. And that is not an ideal way to live. And another thing that you mentioned is diet culture. And I feel like, so I grew up in the 90s. I went to high school in the 90s. Not a great time for your your headspace as a woman. And looking back, now that I've learned more and I've educated myself more on this whole topic, I know what it is. But for people who maybe they've heard the term, but they don't really know what it means or like why it has impacted so many women, can you kind of just describe to us what is diet culture and how does it affect us, and on a conscious and unconscious level, maybe even?
Yeah. Diet culture is an interesting system. And I really want to emphasize, and I'll continue to as I talk about it, that it's a system of beliefs. There's a lot of misconceptions that I see. What does diet culture mean? What does anti-diet mean? Because sometimes we'll see those words, terminologies show up. And so one of the things I like to think about is that it doesn't mean, first and foremost, that you need to be engaging in a diet with capital letters, right? To be affected by and or participating in diet culture. Let me take one step back and zoom out. Diet culture is a system of beliefs that has a couple different pieces to it. One, that there are certain foods that we pedestalize, name as healthy, better, cleaner, superior, even morally superior, and some foods that we demonize, unhealthy, dirty, not morally superior. It's a system of beliefs that says that judges people based on their body shape and size, judges them based on what we think about their intelligence, about their education, namely that thinner is better in terms of the one of the beliefs that diet culture espouses. It's a system of beliefs that says that no matter how much it impacts your mental and physical well-being, that you should be constantly in the pursuit of thinness. And it's a system of beliefs that we exist in, that we're essentially born into, that we get exposed to all the time from various sources constantly. So, is dieting part of diet culture? Yes. Following a diet, following a wellness plan, cutting out foods and food groups. Is it, though, diet culture to be participating in a diet? Sort of falls, I like to think about it like as an umbrella, right?
Hmm.
But we don't have to be on a diet to be participating and or be impacted by diet culture. There are other larger systems that we exist in. If we think about, for example, the patriarchy, these are big systems, big beliefs that we get and hear through the medical system, that we get through social media, that we get through advertisements, that we get through public policy, right? Because we're not just talking about things on the micro level, we're thinking about things on the macro level, right? What do we believe and think about fat on bodies? What are we told about health and well-being? And in the diet culture system, it's that you're only healthy if you're thin, that you are smart, intelligent, capable, and well if you're thin, and that you should be eating a very specific kind of food or set of foods. And those kinds of foods indicate moral superiority and sometimes even class.
Oh, wow. That's such a great explanation of diet culture. And thank you for that. And that's also like what you said about it. You don't have to be like participating actively you're in it. Like saw a video yesterday, and it was a video about how it was like I think it was the early 2000s, of how certain celebrities were picked apart because they went on tour. I think it was Jessica Simpson, and she had it's that classic, they just body shamed her. And, think of all the people who are watching that thinking, oh, that's fat. They were fat shaming her. And that's just how it's been. Until you take a step back, it's hard to like in that moment where I was seeing all of that, I didn't really, I don't know. I don't know how I took it in because I was so much younger, but that's an example to me of how we're as a society, how deep we're in diet culture.
Saturated by it. I think that's actually one of the challenging parts when we begin to see diet culture. So I know that this analogy is used a lot, but I think that it's really helpful, which is, this idea of fish in water not knowing and being able to see the water. And if we think about
Mm.
ourselves as fish swimming around and diet culture being the water, it's like someone coming along that isn't a fish saying, this water that you're swimming in, like, you need to get out of it. First of all, it's water, and this water is not healthy for you. It's toxic, right? And you're like, first of all, what water? What's water? Right? So to awaken ourselves, I think, to the fact that diet culture exists, to understand what it is, understand the impact of it, can be really challenging. It can be liberating, but it also at first can be really challenging, disappointing, hard to navigate, sometimes even lonely, because so much of the disordered behaviors and disordered thinking around food and bodies is sort of normalized. And so when we begin to see, oh, that's actually quite disordered, or oh, that's not okay, that's not in alignment, that's not truth, it can feel challenging to begin, I think, to awaken oneself to the fact that it's not what they had been told their whole life, that they've been lied to in many ways about a lot of things when it comes to food and bodies.
Yes. So, say you have someone listening to this and they're wondering if they have some of these issues or how it could be coming to fruition in their own bodies and minds. What are some things that you see, like with your clients, like some examples of disordered eating, perhaps, or different things that go on in the mind that can be so draining and negatively impacting them?
One thing that comes up quite a bit is fear around food,
Mm.
fear of eating the wrong foods, fear of the harm. Oftentimes it's described as the harm that certain foods might cause. We are exposed to so much unending information, especially in the climate that we exist in, on social media, that we can get to this place where we feel quite afraid of eating generally. And then especially if we add to that a lifetime of maybe diets we've been on or things that we've tried. So fear is something to pay attention to. And this can apply to specific ingredients in foods. It can also apply to specific food groups. A very common one now, and it's been this way, since like the early 2000s, is carbohydrates. Being afraid of carbs, being afraid of sweets, being afraid of including. It can also apply to fat. Protein tends to be it just never goes away in terms of how we pedestalize and elevate it. Not to say that it's not an important macronutrient group, but only to say that I think fear tends to be one of the biggest things that we would want to be curious about if we're wondering, is there something going on with my relationship with food? Am I practicing unintentionally or engaging in, more specifically, disordered eating? Do you feel afraid of food? Do you notice that your fears around food get in the way of you living a full life? And full life can mean different things to different people. I often think of socialization, going out, spending time with people, eating with your kids if you have kids, feeling able to experience pleasure and joy with food, which is often taken and robbed from us at a young age and then continues by virtue of existing in diet culture. So, paying attention to how much fear and preoccupation there is about food and the foods that you either are eating and or are intentionally not eating because there's some worry or fear around those foods.
Yeah, and we talked about this a little bit too, but that's why I'm very careful on my podcast because I know how influenceable it can be when you like open your phone and it's like this is bad. The other day I saw a podcast or a video of a podcast and this lady was saying that absolutely you should never have oatmeal. And it, because of X, Y, and Z. And I remember thinking immediately, like, I was in a place where I would be like, oh, I'm not having oatmeal anymore, because she sounded like she knew what she was talking about. And I am on a weight loss journey, and I do care about what I put in my mouth. And absolutely, like, that would have been something that I would have taken out of my routine. And I do love oatmeal. So it is now that I'm more aware of these things and the messaging, like, that's why, I don't want that on my podcast. I don't want that type of, like, you need to take, it's just not true. And it just creates problems for so many people. And I was one of them. So I know that from experience. And I think when you have um, a client who has been in that fear mindset, and maybe they're restricting food, and maybe they're over exercising, or whatever it may be, because there's so many different types of eating disorder behaviors, what do you start with? Like, where do you start with somebody like that? And I know we'll talk about this a little bit later, but the intuitive eating piece that I only learned about a couple years ago, I want to say. When is that something that you introduce? And maybe this is a lot of questions, sorry, but maybe you could talk to us about what is intuitive eating. So sorry.
Yeah. No, it's okay. It's okay. All really great questions. So let's take a couple steps back if that's okay. And
Yes.
then we will loop right back to intuitive eating. What is it? Because there's also a lot of confusion
Yeah.
on the internet, a lot of people that use intuitive eating that, I have a lot of questions for them about, but we'll put that aside for a moment and go back to a really important point that you made, which is that it can feel really hard. And I was so susceptible to this. So I used to have an eating disorder. I had something called orthorexia, which is this, people describe it, or it's described clinic as sort of this unhealthy obsession with healthy. But nonetheless, the point of that is anyone who is anyone can go on the internet and say whatever they want and add, and research supports this.
Mm.
And if they show up as confident and clear and add in some fear in there, right? This is bad for you, in fill in the blank some kind of way. We are incredibly vulnerable as humans, especially in this time that we exist in, to messaging in that way, especially if they are saying something that's been repeated a bunch of times. Because what sometimes can happen is someone will say, oh, well, sugar is just like drugs and it's terrible for you and you are going to develop diabetes. These are really common things that I'm sure we've all heard. And then you do a search and everything on Google might support what you've heard. And then you go into this panic, oh my God, I need to be cutting out sugar and my kids shouldn't have sugar. And oh my gosh, I'm causing this. And then we get really worked up, rightfully so, really afraid, and don't quite know how to disseminate information. I think this could apply to a lot of things. Just how do we
Mm.
disseminate information that we receive on the internet? And in particular, in this case, when it comes to food. So my advice and first step around that is try to keep that in mind as best as possible. Try to have other sources that you're checking your information with. I talk quite a bit about food, educate about food in the work that I do. And there's plenty of other dietitians like me on the internet where you can go to freely and that have lots of information to sort of check these things. And I think, again, in continuing sort of with the questions that you asked of how do we go from, let's say we're in a state where we have been exposed to a lot of things. We have these beliefs about food. They're being reinforced by our social media because the algorithm's like, hey, you like this information, so we're going to keep feeding it to you. And now it becomes a more firmly rooted belief, right? Now it becomes something that feels like it's real. How do we get out of that? Where's the path out? And for some people, it might be intuitive eating. And I'm going to share more specifically why I say might.
Mm.
I think intuitive eating has a lot of value. I am a certified intuitive eating counselor. I think that intuitive eating really conceptually is the process of reconnecting to your innate wisdom internally about food and nourishment, connecting to what we call interoception, which is hunger and fullness, satiety and all the nuances around that. It includes challenging the diet mentality. It includes understanding that we have a lot less control over our body shape and size than we've been told to believe. What I will say, though, is that I do not tend to start with the principles of intuitive eating at first with someone, because that to me is the equivalent of going from 0 to 100. If we have been disconnected from our bodies for a long time, which most of us have, if we are feeling confusion around hunger and fullness, if we're not eating consistently, so therefore we don't have consistent hunger cues, which is very common, if we're experiencing binge eating, if we have all of these things, and then I say, just trust your hunger, just trust your fullness, you've got this, don't listen to what other people say, or some version of that. I mean, I would never actually say that, but that's sort of the messaging.
Right.
It can feel really scary, really overwhelming. And for some people, even it can end up turning into a diet, right? We go from one dieting mindset to another. We just apply it to intuitive eating, right? I need to get hunger and fullness right. And we end up kind of getting hyperfixated or obsessed with intuitive eating in the same way. So I tend to approach eating and healing our relationship more from the start, from let's get back to the basics. What does the body need? And it can sound really simple. And in practice, it can be really hard when we're coming in with that Santa Claus bag of rules and fears and beliefs. Can we get you consistently eating, which tends to look like a lot more food, and is usually, in my experience in working with women over time, is a lot more food than they're used to eating and that they've been told to eat. Can we add in consistent eating? Can we be challenging the beliefs that you have about food and about bodies? Because it's one thing to say, okay, this is what your body needs, this is what food needs to look like. And it's another thing to practice it, because naturally fears will come up about our body changing in shape and size. Fears will come up about maybe specific foods. And so we have to take a lot of steps before often we get to a place where we're even getting consistent hunger cues. I mean, it's hard to trust our hunger cues if they're all over the place, right? Or it's hard to trust our fullness if all we've known is eating to uncomfortable fullness.
Oh, for
So
sure.
I think that there's a lot of steps that I tend to introduce and work on with folks before we get to a place where we say, okay, let's lean into and begin to explore the nuances of hunger and fullness.
Oh, that's really that makes total sense to me. When I first started my wellness journey, I had already been in the skincare industry for years, working on client skin and as an educator for multiple skincare brands. When I learned about how the toxins in our personal care and beauty products could have a negative impact on our health, I knew I needed to make a change. I was used to the result-driven products that I was working with, and I was not happy with the natural products on the market at that time. Although they were safer and cleaner, they did not meet my expectations for results. I created Simply Just Skincare to deliver the results my clients demanded from their products while using natural, toxin-free ingredients. You can check out my clients' results and reviews on my website, simplyjustskincare.com. In 30 days, my clients have reported more hydrated skin, less appearance of fine lines and wrinkles, and more of an overall glow. Our top sellers include our Repair Toner, our Hydrating Undo Serum with hyaluronic acid, and more. I am offering my listeners 20% off their first order with code PODCAST. Check it out in the link in my show notes to get glowing today. So in intuitive eating, if your clients are ready for that step, it's basically just what you said, like listening to your hunger cues, stopping when you're full so that you're not uncomfortable, things like that. Is there something that I'm missing with intuitive eating that you want to share?
So intuitive eating was developed by two authors, both dietitians, in the late 90s. It's had many iterations of it where they've changed some things. It's got either 10 or 11 principles. I can't remember if they've added some over time.
Mm-hmm.
And each principle was created with the intention to challenge all the stuff that we've been told about diet culture, so that someone can get to a place where they feel freedom to eat what they want, and also trust that their body is a source of information, that their body is wise, and that you can use your body to guide the feeding and eating experience with this idea that we are all born intuitive eaters. We see it a lot with young kids, right? They'll speak up when they want certain foods. I mean, of course, with babies, right? They're crying. And that for most of us, it was taken away at some point. And for each one of us, it can vary in terms of age. Maybe we were put on a diet at a really young age, or maybe we saw our mom or our parents eating in a certain way, or maybe there are certain food rules in the house or culturally, right? There's all kinds of things, but usually it's taken away. And intuitive eating is about reconnecting to that which was taken from you at a young age so that you can get to a place where the noise from the outside world, whether it's social media or otherwise, doesn't really impact you, that you know that you're okay, that you're safe, that you can eat a variety of different kinds of foods, that the binge eating has decreased, if not gone away entirely, that there's no longer this felt sense that you need to restrict, and that there's peace with food at the end of it. And it's a lot more challenging than that, right? And so the principles are meant to support someone, not necessarily in an ordered way, like you have to do principle one and principle two, but they are set up in a way to both challenge diet culture, challenge your existing relationship with food, but also to develop a greater sense of presence and trust with your body.
I love that because that's hard to do, especially if you've been, a lot of people. I remember growing up, like the calorie recommendation for people who are going on diets was like 1,200 calories and so low. And then you're basically fighting against everything that feels natural. You're ignoring your body to such a degree that it's like you're completely disconnected. And I wonder what about exercise too, because I know intuitive eating is different than exercise, but I feel like that could be, and this is from personal experience. I remember because I have been an over exerciser and I could have a cold, I could have an injury, but do you think I was skipping the gym? Like, no.
Mhm.
So I feel like that is something that as I've worked on this issue with myself, I've learned to be like, "Oh, okay, like, my body does not need that HIIT class right now," and I've talked about this on the podcast before. What I really need is something more gentle today, and, like, that's something that I was never able to do, and even if I felt like I should do that, I would ignore it because I needed to burn my calories and get my workout in.
I think that exercise isn't talked about enough in
Mhm.
regards to the way that it often is part of people's disordered relationship with food and their body. I remember a couple years ago on my social media talking about exercise bulimia and getting a lot of comments about it because people were like, wait, what? That falls under a purging behavior, which is often mind blowing for people. That when we're using, for example, exercise post meal with the intention to try to burn off what we've eaten, then that falls under the category of a purging behavior, even though, we tend to think about purging in other ways that are common too. And a disordered relationship with exercise is harmful as well, to your point, right? Exercising through injury, exercising when we're on vacation, even though we don't want to, exercising when really we need rest, not feeling like we can take a break, not feeling like we have a choice, exercising because it's a form of punishment, not as a source of energy or restoration. And I think one of the difficult things when we are trying to sort this out, again, coming to this place of, okay, I think something is off, or I'm suffering, or I'm unhappy, and I don't want it to be this way. With over exercise, sometimes, or I would say often, it takes us taking a break from the formalized exercise that we've engaged in for so long to then reestablish a new relationship with movement. And that can be really challenging and it's essential. So for me, for example, exercise was a big part of my eating disorder as well, and just disordered eating over time. And I had to take a break from any formalized exercise for years, which didn't mean that I didn't still move. I decided
Mhm.
anything that I'm going to do is going to be for joy. And so I danced and I walked and I did gentle yoga. So I share that because I think sometimes we feel like, okay, well, we need to stop, or at least that sometimes when we start talking about over exercise, when usually it's taking a break from what we felt like we have to do so that we can understand anew what our true relationship with exercise is. And one of the questions I often like to ask is, if you knew that exercise or movement was not going to change your body shape and or size at all, what would you be doing differently, if anything?
That's such a good question. It's so funny too because a few years ago, started doing this work on myself. And that was one of my big struggles because it was, the food, yes, obviously I have some issues there, but exercise, it's so easy to say, I'm doing something that's super healthy for myself. It's so easy to convince yourself and those around you that this is really, I'm just healthy doing this. And when I was like, okay, when it got to a point where I was consciously, if I missed a workout or if I missed a day, it would upset me. Like I did not like it. And I would never consider like walking exercise. I'm like, that's just not enough. And I did go through those stages of let me do something more gentle because not only was I dealing with that, I was dealing with some chronic health issues. So actually, I was doing a disservice to my body in a big way because I was doing these really intense workouts, which was the opposite of what I needed, but I didn't want to stop. And that was when I sort of realized, okay, this is a challenge for me. This is so deep in my brain. And the funny thing is that I do love exercise, and it was kind of on the other side of it where I'm like I found things that felt good afterwards or during the exercise. And that's when now I have things that are more gentle than I used to do. And I can say that I love them. And if I need a day off because I'm sick or whatever it may be, I'm not upset about it. And so that took time. Like that took a lot of time for me. And also I think just the process of that realization, like it didn't occur to me that my exercise was a problem. Or like I remember doing programs where they were like 6 days. It was like a 2-month, 6-day a week program. And oh my gosh, if I missed a day, it was like I'm upset about it. Like I'm not on track. It was like
Yes.
so upsetting.
Yeah, I think that that's a great example of how normalized disordered relationships with, we talked about food, but in this case, exercise are. That
Mhm.
we are told, it's not like we come up with these things. We are told, usually from a very young age, in so many ways, that your character is defined by your body shape and size as well as how much you exercise, right? And we even hear it in, I believe, very toxic messaging in even those classes or those programs, right? No pain, no gain, and burn things off and continue to show up despite whatever might be going on for you. I would say too, and I'm not sure if this resonates with you, but I would say that a lot of my clients, with whom I really love to work with, have perfectionistic tendencies, hold themselves to high standards. And I was thinking that of that when you were describing, like, if I missed one day, that was very upsetting. And so, part of this work too, and this is why I like to say it's holistic, not necessarily in the sense of how holistic is sort of defined sometimes in our culture. What I mean is including the whole of you in this work, that once we start diving into food and body image stuff, we start to see, oh, there's a lot of perfectionism here. There's a lot of people pleasing here. There's a lot of fear of not doing it right or never feeling like you're doing it right, no matter how much you do, no matter how much effort you put in. And that cycle, that hamster wheel, is defeating, it's exhausting, but it keeps us stuck, right? Because we're
Mm.
never gonna, if we don't understand what's going on, if we don't know how to get off the hamster wheel, we're just gonna keep pursuing, like you said, those programs and that rigorous exercise, and not really feeling like, and this is affirmed by our culture, not feeling like we can take a break, not feeling like we could just go for a walk or rest or take it easy and see the value and not constantly pounding our body, if you will, pushing it to its extremes, that there can be a range of what we experience. And there's a lot of value and health supportiveness in not pushing your body that way all the time.
Yeah. And it's interesting that one of my biggest motivations for working on this issue with myself, and because I did have an eating disorder in high school. And it's funny in my head as a teenager, when I stopped my eating disorder behaviors, I thought I was done with my I don't have an eating disorder anymore. And what I didn't realize was that I very much did, but it was my body issues, my body image, the way that I thought, and the exercise, obviously. But one of the important things that I feel that having all this knowledge is so important is I'm a mom. And I have 2 kids, and, I want their environment to not be a destructive one when it comes to all of these things. And I want, like the over exercise, I don't want them to see me, like, killing myself when I'm sick, or, I want there to be healthy modeling in my house. And it's not just, that's not just the reason that I have an eating disorder, but it's, like you said, we're in this culture. But I think it's really important, especially because even though I grew up in Southern California, where there is a definite expectation of what you look like here. Also, you know, the time in which I grew up it was very popular to be skinny, and my body type is very curvy, and I've always, even when I was very, very thin, and I always just hated that about it. But now kids have to contend with Instagram and TikTok, and they have a whole other set of issues and challenges that we didn't have when we were kids. And a lot of my listeners are moms that have young kids. They're going into junior high, they're high schoolers. And so I thought this would be a good time to ask you some questions about that, because I feel like having this knowledge as a parent, as a mom, is what a gift for your kids. Because if you see something, you may not have my experience, you may not have any idea what this feels like. You have a healthy relationship with food and body, but you might want to be keeping an eye out for signs that your children have. And that's something that I want to ask you about for the moms who have young kids. What can they look for? How can they keep their eye out for signs that maybe their child is going to a dangerous place with their body image and things like that?
So I think with moms, I would say this applies to parents. So I want to be extra careful as we're talking about moms, because I know there's a lot of moms that are listening right now, that what I will say here in a moment is not saying that it's mom's fault
Right.
that kids develop disordered eating or eating disorders. It doesn't mean that it's only in this case as a mom, or if you're a mom listening to this, that it's only you in, for example, if it's a dual parent household, right? Dads also, or other moms or other dads, impact children's relationship with food, as well as everything else that they're exposed to in their life. So I just want to emphasize that, because I think moms are so blamed for so much in our world, in our culture.
Yes.
And I just want us to be holding that as we're talking through this, because I'm really thoughtful about, mom guilt and how much they care and love for their children, and how I operate from the perspective of they're doing the best that they can and they don't want to cause harm. And we hold that sometimes we cause harm even when we don't intend to. And there's always opportunity to change, which leads me to my next point, which is it is never too late. I really want to emphasize this. It is never too late to heal your relationship with food in your body. And in this case, we're talking about kids, even if they're in their teens. It's never too late to change the way things are working and operating in your household. It's never too late to do your own healing work. And why am I emphasizing the mom and not the kid in this case? because I believe that one of the most fundamental ways that you can impact your child's relationship with food in their body is by doing your own work around healing your relationship with food in your body. When I work with teens, for example, there is only so much that the teen and I can do if the family system isn't changing and working on their own beliefs about food, their own beliefs about their body, what kind of food rules are in the house, what are the parents saying about the child's body and or other people's bodies or their own body. And so I think it can often feel overwhelming of like, well, where do I start, especially if it's important to a mom to not impact their kid as best as they can, right? Like as you were saying, you wanted to model different kinds of behaviors that maybe you grew up with. I believe that the first place to start is starting with yourself, right? Starting there. What kind of food beliefs do you hold? What kinds of foods are you afraid of? How does this show up at the dinner table? Kids notice everything, unfortunately, as we know, right? We think, okay, well, I'm not actively dieting. I'm not following a diet or I'm not sharing it with them, but they see when you're plating that you're not taking any rice, for example, or carbohydrates, or you're eating less, or while you're eating, mom's always walking around, doing the dishes, not participating. That there's all kinds of ways that they receive messages about food and bodies. So that would be the first place that I would start. The other question that you asked is like, how do you know when to be concerned about your kids eating? Actually, we have a couple of blogs related to teens because we see teens, some of our dietitians at Bravespace work with teens around eating disorders, disordered eating that I can share with you if your guests want to take a look and read that. One of the things we want to pay attention to is how they're showing up to meals over time. Are they restricting any kind of food? Is there any anxiety, anger around food and eating? Of course, are there any compensatory behaviors that are happening that we're seeing shift, right? Is there an increase in exercise? Are we noticing them constantly going to the bathroom or somewhere private after eating? Beginning to pay attention to how they're talking about food, if they share those kinds of things with you, if there starts to be a shift in kind of healthy eating and over focus on certain types of foods and food groups, that we want to be noticing those kinds of things. How much headspace is starting to take up for my teen? And I would say too, there's a couple things related to body shape and size that I think are important to note. On the one hand, one of the things that we can notice is if there's any shift in their body shape and size that draws attention. It can be weight loss, it can be weight gain, and alongside of that, I want to emphasize too that isn't the only thing that we're looking at. There are plenty of teens, this applies to adults as well, that we really won't see a big shift. There might be some change, but they might kind of stay the same body size and or fit into the quote unquote either normal category, which we're using BMI, which BMI is bullshit, but nonetheless, that they fit into the quote unquote normal category, and or they might even be in a larger body size. So as parents, sometimes we assume that everything will probably be or is okay by just looking at our kids' body shape and size. And that's just not true. We know that that's not the case. So we want to hold that can be a measurement of like, oh, are there any significant shifts that are happening right now in our kids' body shape and size, while also holding that that's not the only thing that we're looking at. And there could be nothing that changes with their body shape and size. We don't want to assume that we know what's going on based on how our kid looks. And we see that, oftentimes we go to the pediatrician's office, for example, or to go to a doctor's appointment. They say, oh, well, your kid looks healthy, or they are healthy, or they're at a healthy weight. It doesn't really mean anything when it comes to disordered eating or eating disorder behaviors. And the other thing that I'll say, and I know this isn't always possible, I'm not saying this is as an absolute, the more that we can spend time eating with our kids, the more that we can see anything that's going on. For a lot of kids that I work with, and I get it, especially as teenagers, like they start to drive and they've got so much going on and their moods are all over the place and unpredictable and they don't want to spend time with you. And sometimes they really do need you, right? It really fluctuates. But I would encourage parents to also, when possible, be eating with their kids, because they'll be able to see and pick up on more. But also, as they begin to heal their own relationship with food, ideally they would be a safer place for their kids to say, hey, I'm really struggling and I'm not quite sure what to do about it, or I'm not eating, or I'm skipping lunch, or, this is the experience that I'm having.
Yeah. I would love those blogs.
Yeah.
Because I can make sure that I link those in my blog when we release this episode, because I think the most important thing, like you said, is to start with yourself. But any tips during this time, and back to the mom guilt, like we do have so much pressure. There's so much that we feel responsible for. When something is burdening our children, it really burdens us. Like there's such deep concern, and being able to do that work for yourself is such a gift to them, really. And also to look out for things that might happen in the future with them, because my son is into sports and he wanted to start working out a little bit because he wants to hit the ball farther. And I'm just like, wow, that's a good reason. Like when I think about reasons that you want to exercise, my reason was I want to be thin. It wasn't to be stronger or anything like that. So it's kind of nice that I know I can kind of be aware of different things because of my experience and what I've been through and the work that I've done.
I think it can be really hard as a parent to know how to navigate things as they come up.
Mm,
Even day to day things that they might hear from their kid, because there's multiple things that happen. One, let's say your kid says, oh gosh, I look so fat.
yeah.
Common go to statement. First, you notice what comes up for you in hearing your kid say that, what comes up in your own lived experience. There's that whole experience. And then there's also, how do I respond to my kid in this moment? What do I say? And oftentimes, naturally, our desire is to want to try to make them feel better because we know that they're suffering in that moment. We can connect to it, we can experience it. And knowing how to have nuanced conversations around that, knowing how to hold space for it, knowing how to challenge some of the things that they are being exposed to in our culture that can help them feel supported and confident when they go out in the world is really powerful. And it often requires not often, I would say always, requires some unlearning, some relearning, because there's so much that
Mm-hmm.
we're carrying around as parents that we've been told, how could we not, after, living such a full life, that then makes it difficult to know, how do we respond? How do we respond when our kid comes home and says, in gym class, I learned that I should only be eating, 1,800 calories, and we're doing this experiment where we're supposed to track it? How do we navigate that? What do we say? How do we go about challenging, for example, a teacher, if that's appropriate, to say, I don't want my kid to participate in this, or this is why I don't think it's helpful, right? I think that all of it can be difficult, and over time, it gets easier. That's the other piece that I want to mention. I talk a lot about how challenging this work is. And I will say that over time, it's incredibly liberating and it gets easier, which doesn't mean there aren't hard moments, especially when it comes to raising a kid. But that the more that you learn, the more confident you feel and exist in the world around there not being any foods to be afraid of, that we have a lot less control over our body shape and size, that there are ways of being healthy and well. That doesn't mean that we need to engage in disordered eating behaviors in order to get there, while also challenging all the things that we've been told about fat and fatness and what that means in our culture, that it gets easier over time.
That is such a good point. I wish I would have known that not all bodies are supposed to look the same. I mean, how simple is that? I have a body type. My body type is different than my friend's body type. That was
Mhm.
not common knowledge to me. I just thought I just kept dieting until I got to that body type. And
Yes.
that is something I've only realized as an adult. And that could have saved me a little bit of headaches. But Katherine, you are so amazing. This has been so helpful. I really could talk to you. I actually have so many other things I want to talk to you about. You have to come back because
Yeah.
this is so important. I don't even being in this space and dealing with these issues myself, I've only started to learn about all of this in the last few years. And I feel like it's not as common to know about all of these things. And it's such a great thing to have awareness. And you've done such a great job sharing with us today. And I'm going to have you tell us where we can find you, but also, and before you say that, I will say everyone needs to follow you on Instagram because you have so much valuable information there. So please share with us how we can find you and all of that good stuff.
Yes. So on Instagram, I am currently under Bravespace Nutrition. So definitely follow me, check me out there. I will say I am soon going to just be my name, Katherine Metzelaar, which is where you can find me both on YouTube as well as TikTok under my full name, Katherine Metzelaar. I'm separating the accounts so that Bravespace Nutrition as a group practice has its own space, but nonetheless, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. And I would also love for anyone who's saying, where do I begin, to sign up for my newsletters. Every single week, I send out a newsletter called Dear Diet Culture, It's Me Sunday, where I offer tips and insight and advice around how to heal your relationship with your body. And I also include new blogs on there and videos of the week. I think a lot of times, it just feels like so much that we have to keep up with, especially when we enter into this space. And so I personally love getting newsletters from people that I want to learn from because it means that I don't have to be on social media all the time. So you can definitely sign up for that newsletter on bravespacenutrition.com. And that can also be a really wonderful way to learn. And I offer periodically free webinars, free workshops, free ways of continuing to learn, because I believe that it takes many, many, many sources to begin to unlearn a lot of the things that we have. And then also I think it's important to create community, because when we're shifting from where we've been at to maybe where we want to go, it can feel really lonely. And to see that there's lots of other people on this journey together, I think is important and essential.
It is. What you're doing is so important and so valuable. And I'm so grateful that you were here to share with us. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it. Appreciate it. I'm happy to come back anytime.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. Please subscribe and review so we can reach more people who want to learn to glow alongside us. See you next time.